Yeah.
Okay, let's get going. Lots to do today, so just jump right in. Columbia is seeking grants, develop Stan, using Stan outside of Columbia, creating the grants of a conflict of interest. So what I want to start with today is something that I meant to get done on Tuesday, but we ran out of time. So I wanted to write a function in Stan for the prior predictive distribution and the kernel for a conditional logit model, like we were talking about on whatever day it was, Tuesday. So we'll just create an empty Stan program like this. And then start off like that. So let's say we just want to return like one realization from a closure posterior predictive distribution. So again, all those functions have to start with RNG. And so what are we going to need for a function like this if we want to draw from a prior predictive distribution? For a conditional logit model, let's say with one predictor and have a normal prior on the coefficient of that one predictor. What are the arguments we're going to need for our function that draws from that prior predictive distribution? So we're certainly going to need x. What else are we going to need?
If it's a prior predictive distribution, don't we need realizations of the prior distribution to insert into?
Yeah, well, we're going to create such realizations inside the function and then draw realizations of the data.
We need the mean and the standard deviation.
Right.
That is what we perceive. Yeah, perceived value.
So we're going to need those for the prior. What is it that we're going to need that's particular to the structure of a model for conditional logit? That makes it different from just say like a model with a regular logit outcome or Gaussian outcome. Okay, so well, let's get it started. We can draw a coefficient from normal distribution with mean equal to prior mean, standard deviation equal to prior standard deviation. One thing that I meant to say, but I'm not sure I ever said, is that in Stan you can't specify any arguments by name. You have to specify all arguments by position. That's why it's good to use informative symbol names. But you do have to be careful to put things in the right order. So if I switch prior mean and prior standard deviation around, I would be estimating from like a prior, drawing from a prior that I didn't intend. All right, so then we can create, well, we can pull out, we can then create a linear predictor. Data times the coefficient. Okay. So now, how will we go about drawing from the conditional distribution of the data given x and beta in a conditional logit model, like we were talking about at the end of class Tuesday? So how many things are we going to be drawing? So like you can think in terms, in particular, that like high school and beyond example that we used on Tuesday. What was like the structure of that? Okay, what distribution, conditional distribution of the data is relevant for a logit model? There's the exponential involved in the Softmax transformation, mapping from eta to probabilities, but it's not the exponential distribution like we've used on prior standard deviations and stuff like that, or prior on standard deviations of errors in a normal model. Almost. That's one of the two distributions we talked about on Tuesday, the multinomial. But actually, the one we need is the other of the two distributions that we talked about on Tuesday, which is a special case of the multinomial. Categorical. Okay. So if we're going to draw from a categorical distribution, like how many times are we going to draw?
Multiple parameters that infer give you resulted in a posterior distribution that matched the observed data.
Okay, what's the observed data going to look like?
The vector of x that.
Right. Okay. So whatever x is, like age or income, something like that. Okay, we know that. We can look. What does the outcome look like in a clogit model? You already know the basic structure of the outcome. Should already know. It's a property of the design of the data collection. Okay. What sample space is the outcome on?
Positive integers.
How many positive integers?
Not sure. It would just be like j, the number, like you were saying, what?
Okay, so n sub j is the number of people in each group, and there are j groups, and within each of those j groups, we have a categorical distribution of the outcome. And so what would the sample space for each group be?
Zero or one, because your first success is the only count the first success.
Right, so there's only going to be one success in each group by design of the data collection process, like with high school and beyond. You know, one of the two people in each pair got put into the honors English class, the other was in the regular English class, etc. But you could generalize that to groups that are larger than two. But still, we're thinking of the case where only one is going to be successful within each group. So the sample space for the outcome at the group level is going to be you can think about that for each individual, but you have the constraint that one of them is going to be one within each group and the rest are going to be zero. So really, you're just looking for the index of the success within each group. And that's going to be 1, 2, 3, up to n sub j. So it's a positive integer less than or equal to n sub j. Consequently, as part of our exogenous knowns that go into this prior predictive distribution, we're going to need to know how many groups there are and also how many people there are within each group. Or we can just call that n, I guess. Right, so we're going to declare an integer array of length n. Okay. So let's give ourselves like a counting variable like this. Then we're going to loop from j is from 1 to n. Okay. So if we're going to draw from the categorical distribution, we're going to need probability parameters that are non-negative and sum to 1 and are a function of the etas within each group. So how would we do something like that? Involve the Softmax transformation.
It's just the log sum.
Right. So in terms of logarithms, it was eta divided by the log sum x of all the etas in that group. We're going to actually want not the logarithm, but the actual probabilities because we're going to be drawing. But if we were to do a posterior kernel, then everything would be in terms of logarithms. So this is really the softmax rather than the log softmax, but one is like very related to the other. Okay, so what are we taking the softmax of?
Probabilities.
So so softmax yields a vector of probabilities from the etas in each group. So we're going to need the etas in each group, softmax them, and then draw from the categorical in that group. All right. So that would look something like this. First, we have to allocate a vector to hold the output, y. So we could do something like this. Create a vector of size n sub j. So the segment function is convenient. It sort of says like, take, starting from here and then however many you want from the subvector. You can do the same thing with the colon operator, but then you have to keep track of the start points and the end points. Here I just have to keep track of the start point, and I know from the end that I passed in how many people there are within each group. So here I've pulled out the etas for the jth group, little jth group, and then I can do, something like this. And then I can stick in the jth element of the outcome a draw from the categorical random number generator with parameters pi j. And when I'm done with that, I can just return y. So that's the data generating process assumed by a conditional logit model. And you get basically the outcome for each group. It could be a pair, it could be things of even different sizes. The index of the one person within that group who was success, and then implicitly everybody else within that group is failure. So like I said, this was the data generating process used a couple of years ago. QMSS student modeling like outcomes of the Amazing Race, or Survivor, or anything else. Happened to be the Amazing Race. One person each season wins. By definition, everyone else who started the season loses. So there's going to be one winner per season, trying to model the characteristics as to what sort of people are more likely to win the Amazing Race than not. Used also in, like I was alluding to, I guess, with Keith on Tuesday, epidemiology studies of rare diseases. So if you just do like a simple random sample by calling people out of the phone book, your sample most likely will not contain anyone who has the disease that you're interested in studying. And so what a lot of epidemiologists do is they do something like completely non-random, like they ask the hospitals or whatever who has come in for treatment of this disease, get sort of permission to contact them. Okay, now we have J people who have the disease, and then match it with random people off the street or whatever who don't have the disease but have the same characteristics on their background and stuff like that of one of the people with it, and they match one person without the disease to one person with the disease, or they match N sub j people who don't have the disease to each person with the disease. And they've constructed a totally not random sample that has capital J people with the disease, and for each of those people there's a group of other people, including those who don't have the disease but are sort of similar to the person with the disease on the characteristics, and then doing one of these conditional logit regressions to try to estimate what are the sort of characteristics that would predict who is susceptible to getting this rare disease, stuff like that. You also see it in applied economics, particularly about schooling, things like that. You know, other situations in which you could just estimate a regular logit model, but if you have like a cluster sampling design, where first you sample like some number, let's say capital J schools, and then within each school you're going to subsample in sub J students, and then measure some outcome like do they go to college or not as a function of like stuff in their high school. So you might say, well, that doesn't fit the data generating process for a conditional logit model because you can have more than one person in that group go to college, or maybe zero, depending on what the school is. So it doesn't seem like it would make sense, and it kind of doesn't. But a lot of people in applied economics estimate a conditional logit model in a situation like this anyway, because if you were to estimate a regular logit model, putting in a school-specific intercept, then that estimator, not only of the intercepts, but also of the coefficients on the predictors, is biased across data sets. And the bias tends to be more severe when you're not sampling that many people within each school, but you are sampling a lot of schools at the first stage. And one thing you can do to eliminate the bias is in the coefficients is to estimate a conditional logit model grouping at the school level and taking the number of successes as if it were an exogenous known rather than an endogenous known. And so the task of your model is sort of, given that 4 out of 10 people that we sampled within this school went on to college, which 4 of the 10 were they? Can I get a probability distribution over that? And that is what can be done with sort of a generalization of a cogent model here, where there's 4 successes by design rather than 1. And you can do that for all the schools, but you're taking the number of successes as an exogenous known when really it's endogenous known, something you might want to predict. But by conditioning on the sum of the number of successes within each group, you're able to obtain unbiased estimates of the coefficients at the expense that you can't really do anything to predict how many people from each school or whatever will go to college, because you took that as given. And so I like that example, not so much that I would recommend doing that, but illustrating the difference in motivations between more traditional frequentists who are interested in coming up with estimators that allow you to get unbiased or otherwise asymptotically normal estimates of the coefficients, so they could sort of test the null hypothesis that class size doesn't matter or something like that in terms of achievement in high school, versus maybe someone who like works in a school or more of a supervised learning, where you would want to predict the number of people who from each high school that go on to college or something like that, rather than worrying so much about the distribution of an estimator of coefficients across data sets that you could have collected but didn't. And you can do either one from a Bayesian perspective as well. But what is important to you as far as like the output of a model that you can estimate by quantitative methods dictates the different choices that you see other people out there making. And those aren't necessarily the same choices that you would make if you were taking the Bayesian approach, but you can estimate a conditional logit model, from using our StanArm or whatever, like we did on Tuesday. All right, questions about that? Okay, well, doing the posterior predicted distribution took entirely too long, so we're not going to have a chance right now to write out the kernel. If we were to condition on y, the observed success within each group. But that's something you might practice on your own over spring break or something. You know, write the kernel function that would correspond to this data generating process. Okay, so that was the closure stuff. All right. So the next thing that we want to talk about today is putting posterior probabilities over models. And so all of the sort of information criteria, LUIC and WAIC, DIC, AIC, etc., that we were talking about on previous Tuesday and also the previous Thursday, they're intended to approximate the so-called deviant, which is -1/2 of the expected log predicted density of future data. And in order to enable you to try to identify which models are expected to predict future data the best. There's an entirely different approach, an entirely different question, which is whether some model is right in the sense that the data that you've already collected and you use to get your posterior distribution were more consistent with this model's prior predicted distribution or that model's prior predicted distribution. And in fact, in the so-called M-closed case, M-closed meaning you're going to estimate K candidate models, and one of those K candidate models is the truth. You just don't know which one. So the stuff that we did for information criteria corresponds to the so-called M-open case, where you're sort of agnostic about whether any of your models actually corresponds to the real data generating process, and you're just trying to seek a model or a weighted sum of models that is expected to predict future data as well as you can according to this utility function, without any judgment as to whether 1 or 0 or whatever of the models is true. But there is a strong and long-standing tradition in the Bayesian, people even going back before you could really estimate very many models with Bayesian techniques that really seeks to use Bayes' rule in order to find the probability that one model is true, conditional on one model in the set being true, and to get these posterior probabilities on what model is true. And this really goes all the way back to Harold Jeffreys, who we mentioned a little bit in the context of a Jeffreys prior, which is kind of fallen out of favor in recent years, but that shouldn't diminish the contributions that Jeffreys made. This was back around 1930 or so for the most part. And, before Fisher really came on the scene about 1920 or so, people were kind of mostly Bayesian. They certainly couldn't really estimate any posterior distributions, but they sort of had a Bayesian outlook on things. And then Fisher came along, wrote his book on the design of experiments, derived maximum likelihood, alienated a lot of people, but had a lot of influence, and sort of the tide started to turn toward frequentist inference, which really didn't exist in the 1800s or 1900s, early part of before World War I. But anyway, the tide, because of Fisher, started to move more in the direction of frequentist inference in the 1920s or so, and there was a considerable stretch of time, around 1930, but closer to in the 1940s or whatever, where Jeffreys really was the voice of the Bayesian approach, the only one who was sort of willing to strongly say, but in a professional way, that Fisher was wrong. There were other people like Keynes and whatnot who are thought of as Bayesians and who were influential in economics, but weren't really influential for the Bayesian approach to economics. He just happened to be an economist with, you know, kind of a Bayesian outlook. But in terms of who was the like kind of sole voice in academia almost promoting the Bayesian approach, that would be Jeffries for a long stretch of time in, you know, despite, you know, all the nasty things that Fisher had to say about him and, you know, the Bayesian approach in general. So Jeffries made, you know, huge contributions and was influential on a lot of people, especially Ed James, who in turn, I think, you know, McElraith would identify James as one of the most, you know, influential people behind his book, Statistical Rethinking. Also, you know, I've been persuaded a lot of stuff. There's a book, kind of unfinished book, because James died before he could finish it, on the syllabus, that you can get through Columbia that goes through these ideas more. But for James, you know, really the main proponent of Bayesian inference was Jeffries. And Jeffries sort of had a view that's a little different from what a lot of people are today, in that he thought it was sort of a legitimate question to put prior probabilities on a model being correct that sort of assumed beta is 0. Now, we talked about sort of maybe a more modern view on continuous probability is not putting positive probabilities on points, rather on intervals. But it made sense to Jeffries to set up this problem that's more similar to how, you know, Neyman or Pearson, Egon Pearson, would have set it up, where you have like one model that asserts, you know, this coefficient is 0, and you have another model that asserts this the same coefficient is like 0.4, and we're going to compete these two models against each other, choosing one or the other. And to some people, that sort of seems like a false dichotomy. Like, why don't you just estimate the posterior distribution of this thing and then describe, you know, how much of the posterior is like close to 0 versus how much of it is like really positive versus, you know, if any of it is negative. And you certainly can do that, and maybe you should. But Jeffries was interested in this idea of, okay, if we just have like a horse race between two or some finite number of competing models, can we put posterior probabilities on one being correct, given on each one being correct, given that one in the set is correct and we don't know which it is. And, you know, like I guess I said maybe the first day, there's lots of things that Bayesians find to disagree among each other, and that's just kind of the way it is. And this is probably the most stark area of disagreement as to whether it is a good thing or makes sense to sort of pit a model that asserts a coefficient is 0 against another model that asserts it's 0.3 or something like that. And so, you know, different people have different opinions as to whether that is a good idea, but that doesn't make them less Bayesian. They're still using posterior distributions. They're still doing, you know, Bayes rule, all sorts of things like that. There's all kinds of things that you can spot, like fake Bayesians. But people who advocate these Bayes factors and posterior probabilities, these are real Bayesians. They're just not exactly Columbia Bayesians in their approach. Yeah.
Just a question on something you said. You said pairing one model with a 0 coefficient, one model with a 0.3 coefficient. Mm-hmm. Is it Bayesian was to not get a point, but a distribution. So why couldn't those be?
Right. So you can, what the sort of the position that Andrew Gelman would take, just like estimate the model and you get this entire posterior distribution over that coefficient and all the other ones. But you can also get a posterior distribution over discrete models, one of which may constrain the coefficient to be 0, and another of it to constrain it to be something else, or to be an interval, or whatever. And so this idea of posterior probabilities on models, in addition to posterior probabilities on parameters within models, is sort of the fracture that Jeffries kind of created, because that was something that made sense to him, but that was at a time when not only Fisher but Neyman and Pearson were starting on their book and with the whole type 1 and type 2 errors and all that, and people were interested in those sorts of things. So it's not unusual that he would come up with sort of like the Bayesian version of the type 1 and type 2 hypothesis of Neyman and Pearson. But there were people since the 1930s or whatever who just said, if you could estimate the posterior distribution, which you really couldn't in 1930, just go for it.
Neyman and Pearson, so they were kind of contributed to that null hypothesis testing, but they later became critical of it. Did they become quasi-Bayesian?
No, they did not. But it kind of seems in retrospect maybe they should have. They were anti-Fisher, and Fisher was anti-them. Fisher was anti-everybody but Fisher. But anyway, so Fisher had this idea of like p-values, which is sort of a unit-free measure of evidence against the null hypothesis. But in Fisher's world, there was no alternative hypothesis, so there was no like rejection of the null in favor of the alternative. You just had like, here's the amount of evidence against the null of like no treatment effect. Where Pearson, Egon Pearson, and Jerzy Neyman differed was this idea of, okay, we're going to estimate two models, one of which is, the first model, type 1 model, whatever, or not type 1, but model 1 asserts this coefficient is 0. Model 2 asserts this coefficient is 0.5. And we're going to get like a test statistic for this, and if we reject the null that the first model is correct, or not really null, but we reject the hypothesis that the first model is correct, then we conclude the second model is correct, etc. And so that's where this idea of type 1 versus type 2 errors comes from, of falsely or correctly rejecting the hypothesis that the first model is correct, in contrast to the second model. But all these applied people who tried not to alienate Fisher and Neyman and Pearson simultaneously came up with this mishmash of stuff which neither Fisher nor Neyman nor Pearson would agree with, which is you have this null hypothesis that a coefficient is 0, and your alternative hypothesis is that it's not 0, as opposed to like a particular number like 0.5. You're just like, it's not 0. And then what you see today is a lot of people, failing or rejecting whatever a null hypothesis that the coefficient is 0 in favor of an alternative that it's not 0. And that really doesn't make any sense to anybody. And that was part of the reason why the Journal of American Statistical Association said you shouldn't use like p-values and these sorts of things to decide what gets published. But it's been going on that way for decades, without anybody really advocating it. So it's sort of a weird thing. But anyway, to get back to the Bayesian sort of version of something closer to Neyman Pearson, what's the probability that model J is correct? Conditional on the data? Well, we can just use Bayes' rule. What's the prior probability that model J is correct? The PDF or PMF of the data given model J, and then in the denominator, the marginal probability of the data marginalizing out the model indicators. And you might see, okay, we have a PDF for the data given the model in the numerator here, but that was the denominator when we were thinking about Bayes' rule before. So there's no parameters here. They've been integrated out. So this piece here is the denominator from when we saw Bayes' rule before. And now we have a new denominator, which is just summing up over the M models that you're considering, one of which you're asserting to be true, of the numerator here in order to normalize this and get probabilities that are non-negative and add up to 1 over the candidate's models. And so this idea of putting posterior probabilities on models is very similar to the idea of putting like a clogent likelihood on, you know, the high school and beyond or something like that. Given that one model among our set is correct, what is the posterior probability that each of those models is the correct one? So, like I said, this assumes the enclosed world where you're willing to assert one of the models is correct. You just don't know what it is. But in practice, you know, when you calculate these things, it's basically a contest to see which model's prior predictive distribution was most consistent with the observed data. So this is a contest you can easily win if you're allowed to manipulate your priors after the fact. And so if you're going to go this route, it seems absolutely necessary to me that you would have to pre-register your priors as part of a broader pre-registration thing. Otherwise, you could easily like get the posterior distribution and then like say that was my prior, and then you know you're going to look really good with one of these base things, but you're not really following the rules in the sense that your priors are not really what you before you saw the data. So if you're going to do this, pre-register. There's a lot of bad, so you might say, well, okay, how is this even possible? The reason why we're doing like MCMC is we couldn't figure out what is like the probability of the data given the model integrating out the parameters. And we can't figure it out analytically except in like conjugate cases. But given draws from the posterior distribution, we can kind of estimate it after the fact. And there's a lot of bad estimators of this out there, which is another reason why it's kind of criticized. But there was one in the so-called bridge sampling package, which is pretty good. And it's able to produce error estimates, which I unfortunately didn't do here. I'll put that in before I upload the PDF. But anyway, if we do like a closure model for the high school and beyond thing that we did on Tuesday, and then compare that to just a regular logit model for the same predictors and whatnot, but not stratifying by pair ID. So this logit model is totally wrong because it allows for the possibility that both people within each pair could be in the honors English class, or neither people within each pair could be in the honors English class, which could not happen by construction of the data generating process. And you can get at that with the bridge sampling library. If you're going to do that, you have to specify an additional argument when you call the thing in rstand-arm. Diagnostic file equals some string. That will save some additional information to a CSV file on the disk that the bridge sampling package needs to access in order for it to do its thing and estimate these posterior probabilities on models. So then you call bridge sampler on each of the candidate models and then pass that to postprob. So these are posterior probabilities that each of these two models is correct, given that one of them is correct. And in this case, because the logit model is totally wrong, has the wrong likelihood, you get pretty much, you know, e to the negative 20 for that probability, and 1 for the probability that the cogent model is correct. Now, that doesn't mean, I mean, you're asserting it's true, but it doesn't mean in reality that it's true that you did like the right predictors, or maybe you left out an interaction term, or there's all sorts of reasons why the cogent model could be wrong. But it's not wrong in the way the logit model is wrong, in the sense that it correctly accounts for the fact that within each pair, there's complete dependence in the outcome. Given someone is in the honors class, I know the other person in the pair isn't, irrespective of their exits. Given that someone wins the amazing race, I know all the other people in that season did not. So conditional on the winner or the successful, whatever, you already know what the outcome is for the other people. And that is not taken into account by a regular logit model, and that's why it gets basically destroyed from a posterior probability perspective in this case. But it's still hinging on the assumption that one of these two models is right. And in this case, I don't know if this logit model is right, but the logit model is definitely wrong. And it is reflected in the results here.
Is the logit model just usually better than the logit model?
No, no. But it's for a very particular type of data collection where you have this grouping structure, and by design, there's one or some known number of successes within each group, and complementary to that is the number of failures within each group. So when that's the data collection design, then yeah, conditional logit model is like reasonable and regular logit is not. But for just like, who do you want to vote for in the election, like the Republican or the Democrat, then the number of votes for each candidate is not an exogenous known, something you could fix on within each group. So in that situation, a regular logit model would be plausible, although there's all kinds of reasons why it too can be wrong. But it would be plausible in a way a conditional logit model would not if you don't have the grouping structure such that there's a known number of successes within each group before you even collect the data. Other questions? So you can do that and you will see all kinds of stuff about Bayes factors, which is just like this, except not the prior on the probability for each model. It's considered, well, this whole thing about like doing Bayes factors is sort of considered like a hostile move to begin with. You know, the idea that you can say, okay, you know, your model is wrong with probability 0.7 or something like that. But if you're going to do one of those things, it's sort of the honorable thing to do is to give each of the candidate models 1/m probability of being correct before you see the data. I mean, certainly if you put like a 0.99 probability that your model is correct, then it's going to come out something very close to that in the end. But, you know, have you really achieved anything? You certainly haven't persuaded anybody of it. So anyway, the part to the right and in the denominator, that's called the Bayes factor. And then you can manipulate all that into probabilities over models. So that's Bayes factor. So the model weights that we talked about Tuesday, they're not really probabilities. They're just numbers between 0 and 1 that add up to 1 over the space of candidate models. There was something called pseudo Bayesian model averaging that was talked about on Tuesday, which is kind of, but not really estimating the same thing that the bridge sampling package does. So if you want to do that, I would say use bridge sampling. It's probably the best estimator of this idea. One thing you should not use ever is the Bayesian information criterion, which is not actually an information criterion. It's an estimator of the Bayes factor under very strong assumptions, like it's approximately multivariate normal, so that the priors didn't matter, etc. Anyway, it's Bayes, the bridge sampling is a much better estimator of the inputs that go into the posterior probabilities than the BIC is. So you'll see even like frequentists using the BIC as like an alternative to the AIC. Yeah, that makes no sense. BIC and AIC are not comparable, but BIC is definitely more Bayesian. It's trying to estimate a Bayes factor, but the idea of calculating it from the estimate output by a frequentist procedure doesn't really make any sense. So just don't. Okay, so if you're taking the sort of Jeffrey's mindset that it's, you know, closer to Neyman Pearson maybe, and this idea of testing a coefficient that is 0 versus some sort of other model that it's not, or even if you're not thinking of yourself as like testing a proposition that a coefficient is 0, you're just estimating an exploratory model that has tons of predictors, you're often going to need stronger priors than the sort of default normal ones in R-stan-arm. And this comes up a lot in genetics, where recently there's been like a lot of effort and money put towards like completely mapping out the human genome and like collecting like DNA for all sorts of like families and stuff like that. And then, you know, you go to estimate, you know, what makes somebody susceptible to a particular genetic condition, and you have like millions of dummy variables for like different configurations of chromosomes and stuff like that, and you're trying to basically fishing expedition for figuring out like which of those, if they're on or off, you know, affects the probability that someone would be, you know, affected with this genetic thing. And so you might be estimating a model that has more predictors than it has observations. Like that's totally common in a lot of bioinformatics because it's expensive to do this study. You get something like 12 people who, you know, agree to, you know, have all this like health done on them, and that's expensive. But you can get, if you sort of get down to like the cell level, millions, like more than a million, tens of millions predictors for whatever it is you're trying to study. And in a situation like that, you're going to need stronger than like weakly informative normal priors in order for this to make any sense at all. And the Laplace prior, which is analogous to what's used by Lasso, is not real good in a genuinely Bayesian context. It works in a Lasso context because they're only interested in the posterior mode. And so the only thing that really matters is how does the prior or the penalty function affect the mode. And if you sort of put this cusp at 0, you can get coefficients that are estimated to be exactly 0, or that's what optimizes your objective function. If you were to treat this from a genuinely Bayesian perspective, then you need to think about how the Laplace prior, or the log PDF of the Laplace prior, affects the posterior distribution as a whole, and not just the mode, because you're going to be interested in the posterior mean and median and like everything about the posterior distribution. So the Laplace prior has kind of weird and not very desirable effects on the posterior distribution as a whole. It also has a tendency to shrink non-zero coefficients toward 0 too much, really, more than what most people think is appropriate. And so that has motivated a lot of more genuinely Bayesian people, but even some sort of like quasi-Bayesian people, to search for alternatives that they could use as priors on regression coefficients when you expect or assert most of them to be really close to 0, but doesn't shrink the big coefficients towards 0 that much or too much. And one of those is the so-called horseshoe prior, which also has like some problems with it. And so more recently, people have come up with what has been termed the Finnish horseshoe prior, which is a hierarchical prior, saying for the kth regression coefficients, it's normal with an expectation of 0, but a standard deviation that's, you know, equal to tau times lambda k bar. Okay, what are your prior beliefs about tau and lambda k bar? Well, what are lambda k bar? So lambda k bar is this thing, c times lambda k divided by c squared times, or plus tau squared times lambda k squared. Okay, so now what are your prior beliefs about c and lambda k, in addition to your prior beliefs about tau? Go to the next level, okay? Cauchy distribution, or really a half Cauchy distribution, because this is restricted to be non-negative, on each of the lambda k's, so that is going to have heavy tails. A inverse gamma prior on c squared with shape equal v over 2 and rate equal v over 2 times s squared. So you're going to have to put in v and s squared. And then finally, tau has this also Cauchy or half Cauchy prior, but with a scale of t, which is another thing that you can input as an exogenous known in your prior beliefs. And you might say, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, even though mechanically I could do it in Stan just by following the steps on the previous thing, but you have to do it in reverse order. Oftentimes when you see people present priors like this in terms of like math with like the tilde notation, meaning it's like my beliefs about this are governed by this distribution or whatever, they sort of write it in reverse order compared to what you would have to do for the code. So with the code, you have to start with tau, before you can evaluate some of these other things, and that's what I did on what I did in Stan on this, but we don't have time to go through it. But to draw from a prior predictive distribution using a prior like this on the coefficient, and then how would I do it for a kernel function if I wanted to condition on the data. But even this, you wouldn't actually want to use this parameterization of the kernel function, because when you use priors like the Finnish horseshoe, you often have to do some tricks and reparameterizations in order to prevent divergent transitions. So you can increase adapt delta as high as you want, or as close to 1 as you want, and there still might be divergent transitions unless you do some other tricks that we haven't talked about yet. But anyway, the essence of a prior like this, so we can apply it to this political economy risk data set about the logarithm of the black market premium on exchange rates. But the way in which you can choose a prior is by saying, okay, how many coefficients are there? In this case, there's 12. And having a prior guess as to how many of those coefficients are going to be, not zero-ish. So a sort of non-negligible distance away from 0. So this is sort of an exploratory model, even though there's not that many predictors. But I might say, okay, maybe a quarter of these coefficients are going to be noticeably different from 0. So I'll put in 3. And so it's 3 divided by 12 minus 3, so 9, times 1 over the square root of n, gives you what you need for the global scale parameter t. And then, often the defaults are pretty good for the others. And if you do this with prior BD equal true, it just draws from the prior that you specified, and you can see the essential characteristics of this Finnish horseshoe prior. It is very concentrated at 0, much more than a normal or a T or a Cauchy or whatever, but it has reasonably heavy tails. So sometimes you can get a draw out, -4 or 4, something like that. That has a little bit of probability, but there's a lot of concentration around 0, very close to 0, even though this is finite here. So this captures what a lot of people think is like a good prior for regression coefficients, that it sort of strongly asserts that it's near 0, but it has heavy enough tails so that if in reality it's not 0, you can get posterior distributions that allow it to be big, because you've put sufficiently enough probability mass out into these tails. So that's kind of the essence of this approach. And if you then go to condition on the data using the same prior as before, here, so this was for GDP, the prior distribution of the coefficient on GDP, per capita GDP, and this is the posterior distribution. So you can see conditional on the data, I've really brought in the tails. But it's still sort of peaked at 0. There's a much greater chance that it's negative than it's positive, indicating you tend to have less black market premium in countries that have more wealth. But certainly there's a decent amount of posterior probability that this thing is positive, and a decent amount of posterior probability that this thing is pretty close to 0 as a result of this. But anyway, conditioning on the data really brings in the tails in this case. But if it had a big effect, then the prior wouldn't have been that shrinking on this large effect because it has these heavy tails like this. So the Finnish horseshoe prior is one of the things recommended in this so-called projection pursuit approach to choosing a submodel within a larger model that may have like a ton of coefficients, a ton of interaction terms, all kinds of things like that. And there was a quote that I heard from Rob McCullough, and it really crystallized things for me. He was quoting somebody else, but I didn't start listening until he started getting into the quote. So I can't remember who it was he was quoting. It's probably one of his buddies, like Cavallo or somebody like that. But anyway, he said, and I think this is more or less an exact quote, that sparsity, which is to say a lot of the coefficients being 0, is an input to your utility function over models, not an assumption to impose on the models a priori or on a posterior distribution. And that's in contrast to the way that the lasso people and stuff like that do it, which is to sort of constrain their optimization problem so that you tend to get these exact zeros. Rather, a better approach from a Bayesian perspective is to estimate an encompassing model and then, as a sort of decision theory thing, try to choose a submodel within that larger model that makes you happiest if you have some additional considerations, such as it's costly to keep collecting data. So I don't want to be collecting data on variables whose coefficients are basically 0 and like are close enough to 0 that they don't matter. But if I had to collect those data on those variables, it would be costly to me. So I might want a model that's not like totally correct, but is cheaper and it's not way worse. Or, my boss doesn't know anything, and so like explaining to him a complicated model would take a month. So can I get away with a simpler model that's going to be almost as good? That sort of utility calculation is what's behind this idea of the projection pursuit approach implemented in the projpred package by Aki and a bunch of his postdocs and grad students and whatnot. It has this var cell function that you pass to it something fit by rstan arm and stored in this thing called fit_vs, which is going to hold a lot of the information needed on the next couple slides. And then you can do the var cell plot of that, calculating the expected log predicted density and the root mean squared error. So these are going to go in opposite directions. And this is sort of telling you that, well, you could estimate a model that had like 4 predictors or 4 coefficients instead of like all 12. And the ELPD would be like almost as good. The expected ability to predict future data for some model that has only like 4 coefficients would be like almost as good as the full model that has 12. So how can we get at that? But this plot is sort of subject to the biases that come about from like using the same data to condition on to get the posterior distribution originally, as it is to choose a submodel within that. And so a better approach is to use some cross-validation stuff to counteract that a little bit, which you can do with the CV_ var cell function. And there's different methods here, but method equal forward is the one that is recommended in the documentation, and then call the suggest_size function, which will tell you, as a result of that, how like what sort of model would be expected to give you the expected log predicted density that is very similar to the full model. And it turns out in this case, you could get away with just having 1 predictor, and it would do almost as good as a model that had all 12 that you started with. And then when you plot that, you can see it's adjusted the estimates to take into account the bias. And indeed, you can see, okay, there is a model that has one among your original 12 predictors that's just as good as the 12 predictor model in terms of expected log predictive density, ability to predict future data. So like, which model would that be, or which predictor is that? You can use the project function. And this is an important concept. What most people would do if you say, okay, well, here's a model that like you can just put in one predictor and it's as good as a model that has like a whole bunch. They would be like, okay, let me re-estimate that just with that one predictor and then go with it. But that ignores the uncertainty in the previous like 4 steps. You're not totally sure that this one model is, you know, tantamount to the model that you estimated originally. And so rather than just pretending you were sure and going on to estimating that model that just has one predictor, you need to project the original big model that you started with down to a one-dimensional model and allow that uncertainty in that projection process to affect the reweighting of the posterior distribution for that projected model. And so you need to call project with, in this case, NV equal 1 for one variable. There's also proj_linpred and predict if you want the linear predictor or the posterior predictions from the projected model, which only has one coefficient, but takes into account your uncertainty that came from the big model and your uncertainty as to whether a one predictor model really is adequate. But anyway, we can plot this, and it turns out that the one predictor that really is necessary in order to get the same expected log predictive density is PRSX25, which I don't know what that is. But it, along with the intercept and like the standard deviation of the errors, would be like not really worse than the original 12 predictor model. But there were all kinds of reasons why the original 12 predictor model were also bad. So I wouldn't, you have to do more than what I've done here to verify that the base model that you start with is not horrible, which actually it kind of was in this case, which we saw a couple weeks ago or whatever. But anyway, the steps of like doing CV Varcel and making these plots and suggest the submodel and then going into this thing to pick out the first most important of the predictors, etc. Then you get this projected posterior distribution that you can then use to get projected posterior predictions and all kinds of other stuff like that using the functions in the projpred package. And so that is a better alternative, an alternative from a Bayesian perspective. If you're kind of doing like more of an exploratory model where you're just kind of throwing in like a whole bunch of predictors and a whole bunch of interactions, not really having any theory as to what any of those might be, but knowing, you know, the nature of social science that most things don't matter. And so you're sort of willing to believe like the overall distribution of coefficients is pretty concentrated around 0, but every once in a while you get lucky and something pops out as making kind of a big difference. Now, if you do this from a frequentist perspective, what pops out is like subject to p-hacking and what Andrew Gallman talks about is like type S and type M errors that, you know, if you sort of only look at the published research, which has this implicit rule that the p-value has to be below 0.05 in order for it to get published, then you get a very distorted view because you only see like the published papers and whatever. Anyway, there's when that happens, there's a high probability that when you see something being statistically significant, it has like the wrong sign. Or even if it has the wrong sign, it has like totally the wrong magnitude because you've just capitalized on noise. Those things are still kind of relevant considerations from a Bayesian perspective, but because we have priors to oppose additional information that's not just available in the data, that, you know, most things in social science do not have big effects. That sort of counteracts a good bit this sort of tendency that you see with the frequentist stuff to just like estimate something with a really small sample and, you know, keep playing around with the data until something pops up. And when you see, you know, something that looks interesting in the results, publish it if it's statistically significant. That has pretty much no scientific value and has led to a lot of problems that have recently like uprooted the entire discipline of psychology. But those things are diminished if, one, you spend a little bit of time thinking, but two, use a Bayesian approach where you can use your priors to moderate the influence of like weird quirks that come out of a particular data set that aren't at all generalizable or even, you know, true. So a few more minutes today. Want to talk about product normal priors, which are another idea in this sort of similar to Finnish horseshoe in terms of putting priors when you really think zero is a pretty, or near zero is a really likely situation. So the so-called product normal distribution is the distribution of a product of two or more normal random variables, each that has an expectation of zero. So on the second homework or whatever, we learned about the distribution of the ratio of two normal variables. So this is the distribution of the product of two, or in general, little n normal random variables, each that have an expectation of zero. And this PDF, it's not easy to write down in any sort of a useful form. It generally involves the Meyer-G function, which I won't subject you to. But there's a recent paper, or I think it cited some other paper, that derived what the density function approaches as x goes to zero or as x goes to infinity. Look at this and you see, well, it's got a logarithm of the absolute value of x in the numerator as x goes to zero. And so if x is exactly zero, then this all goes to infinity. So the density is literally infinite at zero. Now, remember, the density function is just the slope of the CDF. And so that's telling you the slope of the CDF is vertical at zero. But it integrates to 1. So again, don't get too caught up on the height of the density at particular points. You need to consider the whole shape of the density function. And as x gets big, then the tail of the density function has this, which is much heavier than the tail of a like normal distribution or an exponential. So it has the same sort of characteristics, a lot of concentration near zero, but heavy tails. And you can see that we can plot the PDF reasonably well when n is only 2. It involves the so-called modified Bessel function of the second kind, which is not to be confused with the modified Bessel function of the third kind, which is the same thing. But anyway, it has this shape, and I didn't plot it all the way up to infinity because you wouldn't be able to see the rest of it. But at zero, the density function is literally infinite. And so the prior mode is on zero. And irrespective of what the data are, the posterior mode of this coefficient is going to be zero, because nothing can be bigger than infinity. But the posterior median doesn't have to be zero. The prior median is zero. Posterior mean doesn't have to be zero. The whole thing can be shifted around by the data, but the mode is always going to be zero, irrespective of what the data have to say. And that, I think, reinforces this idea that you don't want to get too caught up on the posterior mode. You need to think about the entire posterior distribution, or if you're going to reduce it down to a single number, at least think about the mean or the median or whatever that sort of is influenced by the entire posterior distribution, rather than just focus on the mode, which is just like literally 1 point and really isn't any more important than any other. You can do this in R-stan-arm by just doing prior equal product normal. DF is the number of normal distributions to multiply together. Scale is the prior, or not the prior, but the literal value of the sigma things that get multiplied together to get the scale of the product normal. And then you compare, the posterior distribution versus the prior distribution, for one of these things, and you see, okay, it has a reasonably heavy tail or whatnot in the prior, but it's something that can be shifted by the data, in the posterior distribution, that this PRSX25 again pops out as having, a pretty big coefficient. And so, yes, you put a lot of concentration near zero, but that didn't stop a coefficient that seems to have a relatively big effect from having a bounded and reasonably big, reasonably precisely estimated effect that's bounded away from zero in the posterior distribution. Yeah.
But posterior is viewed as a compromise between the likelihood and the prior. If we're giving like very small probability in those tails, wouldn't that just pull it away from the likelihood?
Yes. So this is going to shrink even big ones towards zero a little bit, but it's going to have the property that sort of like for sufficiently large effects and for sufficiently large data sets, the influence of the prior becomes more and more negligible. Whereas like Laplace and some other priors like this don't have this property that it becomes negligible in the limit. And so that's one of the reasons to kind of prefer product normal or finish horseshoe, whatever. But also this intuition that like posterior is a compromise between prior and likelihood kind of only is true literally when you have only one parameter. If you're thinking about a multi-dimensional parameter space, what it means for the posterior to be between the likelihood and the prior is not exactly a well-defined thing, because you're talking about a multi-dimensional space. So it can be like between in some respects and not between in other respects. But that's usually the situation we're in. So I wouldn't push that too far, but again, I think it could be made sense in terms of the priors we talked about. Okay, a little bit over time, but we're not going to have class next week. Also not going to have office hours next week, but feel free, because we're on spring break. But if you have questions, feel free to post about them on Campus Wire, review, practice, and we'll pick it up after spring break, start learning about the BRMS package, which will generate STAM programs for you. Also start to learn about multi-level models, and hopefully, go into April strong. So see you after spring break.